Welcome to my channel. This is Captain Binoy Varakil, Assistant Professor, Department of English, St. Joseph's College, Devagiri, Kozhikode. This is the fourth lecture in the lecture series on Accidental Death of an Anarchist by Dario. In the previous lectures, we looked at the career literary contribution of Dario. So also we discussed the background to the play Accidental Death of an Anarchist. And in the third lecture we saw the characters of the play. And today we begin the discussion of the summary of the play. And in this lecture we discuss Act 1, Scene 1 of Accidental Death of an Anarchist. Accidental Death of an Anarchist is essentially an inquiry or counter-inquiry into a specific incident, so the plot does not feature the development of action or character. It is rather a challenge to a false version of events put about by authority figures. The momentum of the play is provided by the gradual increase of knowledge and the incident itself, and by the variety of farcical situations in which the challenge is mounted. Act 1, Scene 1. The maniac, who is never given a name, enters by the window. The window is a device for focusing the audience's attention from the very outset on something which is more than stage furnishing. The window is at the heart of the investigation of the event which makes up the plot. The office into which the maniac enters is in a police station. Inspector Bertoso, whose office it is, comes in by the door, accompanied by a constable. The maniac is obviously known to them, since they immediately produce a file with his previous convictions, all for acts of impersonation. The maniac is no deranged individual with no control over his actions, but an obsessive character whose supposedly insane behavior takes the form of a compulsive need to act out a variety of roles. He has managed to pass himself off as, among other things, a surgeon, a bishop, and a psychiatrist, but has spent some time in a mental hospital where he acquired a knowledge of law. The ensuing dialogue between the inspector and the maniac is an exercise in deliberately illogical, zany, nonsensical clowning, whose aim is to disorientate the ponderous police officer. But it also shows the maniac's gifts for the improvised, off-the-cuff witticism and his ready inventiveness. He launches on the first of the many wild monologues he will deliver during the play, but the subject is not quite random, since he ridicules judges for their arbitrary power and for their freedom to remain on the bench at an age when their clarity of mind is diminishing. He succeeds in exasperating the officers, but offers to get out of their way by throwing himself out of the window, a very obvious reference to the fate of the anarchist. They show him the door and exit themselves to attend to some business. Immediately afterwards, the maniac returns to retrieve his papers, but finds the office deserted. He flicks through documents piled on the inspector's desk and throws some of the charge sheets out of the window, preserving others. In his search, he comes across one file which attracts his interest, the report made by a magistrate in charge of an investigation into the death in custody of an anarchist never named in the play, suspected of involvement in a bombing outrage. The maniac's examination is interrupted by a phone call from another inspector who, it transpires, is the officer who had been conducting the interrogation of the anarchist at the time of his mysterious death. The maniac gathers from the inspector news of the imminent arrival of another judge to revise the previous findings and to re-examine the police conduct in the case. But he drives the inspector into a rage by pretending to speak for Bertoso and saying that the two of them find the problems facing the inspector downright hilarious. To aggravate the offense, he conveys over the phone mocking messages and rude, derisive gestures supposedly from Bertoso, and tells the inspector that once his responsibilities for the anarchist's death have been uncovered, the best he can hope for is to be dispatched to a new posting in a remote, barren, unfriendly place like Huddersfield. Once off the phone, the maniac seizes his opportunity and begins to rehearse walks and poses which would help him pass himself off as the expected judge. He stuffs documents into a bag, but before he can get any further, Bertoso returns. He is so anxious to get rid of the maniac that he ignores his warning to watch out for an enraged inspector out to wreak vengeance for his insolence. The inspector returns up and the scene closes with him throwing a punch at his colleague Bertoso. That is the end of Act 1, Scene 1. Now we look at the gist of Act 1, Scene 2. The scene shifts to the inspector's office on the 4th floor, the very place where the interrogation of the anarchists had taken place. The maniac has already taken up his stance there when the inspector and the constable enter. The self-confidence of the intruder disconcerts the officers, more so when he identifies himself as the judge entrusted with the new inquiry. The initial exchange contains the cut and thrust of comedy routines, but all the cutting and thrusting is done by the maniac judge. He insists on issuing a peremptory summons to the superintendent, the senior officer in the police station. The superintendent charges in all indignant bluster at being given orders by an inferior officer, and the initial exchanges have once again the quality of nonsensical comedy which arises from mistaken identity. Such mistakes over identity are of the essence in this farce. Once the superintendent realizes that he is in the presence of a high-ranking judge, he becomes more of differential and attention is turned to the matter in hand. The maniac picks up use of the word raptus, which means seizure, in an earlier report to establish what caused the sudden seizure, asks the officers to reenact their interrogation of the anarchists, beginning with the famous intimidating entrance of the superintendent. The policemen condemn themselves out of their own mouths, admitting in the reenactment and in the words exchanged with the maniac judge that they had fabricated evidence to frame the anarchists for the bombing, or else lied about evidence they did not have so as to induce the raptus which caused the alleged suicide. Other hypotheses are produced in the court replay of the events. There is no one explanation of the actual circumstances of the death advanced in the play. The satirical reconstruction aims to expose the behavior of the police on the fatal night and to undermine the various absurd explanations put forward by them to justify their actions. It transpires that the anarchist was threatened with dismissal over alleged but unproved implication in the bombing, was told that his alibi had collapsed, and was wrongly informed that his alleged accomplice in the outrage had confessed. The cowed policemen agree that all these allegations were false. They fear that they will be made scapegoats and that the politicians, having made use of them, will abandon them to the scorn of the press and the public. They fear that they will be made scapegoats and that the politicians, having made use of them, will abandon them to the scorn of the press and public. They still balk at the maniac's first suggested way out by the same window as the anarchists. At this stage in the carefully planned structure of the play, there is a comic pause in the action as the characters and the audience are given a chance to digest the information they have been given. The police officers are left demoralized and depressed as they face their predicament, but the maniac changes tack, tells them to cheer up since he has been fooling them. His plan, he now says, had been to make them realize the hopelessness of their position and encourage them to devise a more plausible explanation of what had been going on that night. In the new version, the raptus theory is jettisoned, abandoned in favor of a more sophisticated tale which takes account of the gap of 4 hours between the onset of the raptus and the fatal jump. The problem of what occurred in those hours is left to one side as the maniac persuades his charges that they had really been engaged on lulling the anarchist into a state of inner tranquility. Other contradictory statements about his state of mind are almost incidentally produced. That he was completely calm, or that he was nervously drawing on a cigarette. And as the play takes another turn towards pure farce, the maniac gives a recapitulation of the allegations and facts so far established. The police had fabricated evidence. They had brought in an innocent and healthy man who had died, while in their case they had demoralized him with falsehoods. They had produced contradictory versions of what has led to his death. The only way they could redeem themselves, he suggests, is to show that they had behaved with humanity towards the increasingly desperate prisoner. Perhaps he suggests it had occurred to the inspector that the anarchist was a railway man, that he had remembered playing with trains as a child himself, and that he had therefore given the anarchist's cheek a kindly pat. Or perhaps they had had the idea of a cheery sing-song, maybe involving an anarchist anthem. The act ends with the maniac and officers lustily singing the song they had supposedly sung with the anarchists. With that, we come to the end of Act 1, Scene 2. Now we move on to the second act of the play, Accidental Death of an Anarchist. Act 2. There are no divisions into scenes given in Act 2, but there are certain natural breaks in the action. The curtain rises to reveal the performers in exactly the positions they had been in at the end of the previous act, still singing. The inquiry takes up from where it had left off. It is agreed that the superintendent had been absent at the crucial moment, but that the inspector was one of the people present in the office throughout. The maniac switches tone and mocks the police for the suggestion that they had been joking with the suspect. He goes off into a comic routine about depressives presenting themselves for interrogation in police stations for a good laugh. The police at this point begin to suspect that the maniac is not as reliable a supporter as they might have imagined, but the discussion darkens, bringing up inconsistencies in the original reports. How plausible is the suggestion that the supposedly calm anarchist impulsively threw himself to his death just because insinuations were made against his fellow anarchist Valprada, the dancer. The two were not on good terms, so could a few random insults to a man he did not like really drive him to suicide. The maniac, tongue in cheek, raises the possibility that the anarchist had killed himself just to spite the police, but this is too much even for the slow-witted officers. Other anomalies are raised and dismissed. Why was the window open on the coldest night of the year? How credible was the claim that a policeman showed his anxiety to save the anarchist by grabbing his foot as he rushed to the window, allegedly pulling off his shoe when it was noted that the body had one shoe on either foot as it lay on the ground? The decisive change of tone occurs when it is announced that a journalist has arrived to conduct an interview with the inspector. The maniac advises that she be allowed to come up and offers to use his skill for disguise to stay in the office and give such help as is needed. He initially claims to be an officer from the forensic department of the police, but dresses himself in eye patch, wooden leg, and false moustache. His attitude towards the incisive questioning of the journalist disconcerts the whole group, since he is in turn helpful and obtrusive. She asks the inspector why he has the nickname Window Straddler, and the maniac intervenes, making fun of the question. Hoping to establish whether the body was still alive when it was ejected from the window, she asks about its trajectory, and the maniac sides with her. She turns to the timing of the call for an ambulance. And he is back on the police side, but from the audience point of view, his intervention is irrelevant. The important point is that these questions are aired in public. He then raises the completely new possibility that the anarchist had been assaulted in the office and had lost his balance, falling out of the policeman's hands at the window while trying to regain his breath. Although the journalist's questions are unremittingly serious, the tone of farce is maintained in part by the maniac's witticisms and in part by his loss of the glass eye, which is placed in a glass of water and drunk. The tempo is now raised even further as various other points are brought up, such as the dismissal of the anarchist's alibi that he had been playing cards with old age pensioners. This fact is an excuse for a digression on the position of retired folk who were suffering from industrial disabilities, but the final coup de scene is the arrival of Bertoso. The disguise of the maniac is now a game of double bluff. Bertoso thinks he recognizes him, while the others are afraid that Bertoso will blow the maniac's cover in front of the journalists. No one is more pregnant with farcical potential. The maniac adopts disguises of increasing extravagance, and the comic effect of the kicks and blows which rain on Bertuzzo from colleagues is heightened by his total unawareness of what he has done to provoke his response. Bertuzzo is carrying a bomb, a replica of the one used for the explosion at the bank. The journalist inquires why the original bomb, which failed to detonate, was exploded rather than rendered harmless, and examined, and why the information given by the neo-fascist infiltrators into the anarchist group was not acted on. Meantime, the maniac himself takes on the role of agent provocateur, encouraging the journalist and advancing theories of his own as to why the police in their investigation of the bombing failed to follow up alternative leads involving Italian right-wing groups or international secret service agencies. As his eye patch is removed and his wooden leg comes off, the maniac delivers a speech on the importance of scandals in social democracy, explaining that they serve as safety valves. Political misdeeds can be blamed by the media on dubious individuals, not on deeper intrinsic flaws in the system. In this way, public anger is neutralized. Bertuzzo's exasperation grows, but his colleagues become increasingly irritated with his efforts to reveal who the judge is, and resort to such desperate measures as binding his mouth with tape. The maniac himself replies by adopting an even more ludicrous disguise as a bishop. In desperation, Bertuzzo produces a gun. He handcuffs all the police officers, the journalist and the maniac to a rail at the back of the stage, and is finally able to show them who this supposed judge really is. The maniac replies by grabbing the bomb and threatening to set it off unless Bertuzzo hands over the gun, which he does. The maniac reveals that he has a tape recording of the entire conversation, but since the others are all tied up and he has the bomb, there is little they can do. He announces his intention of sending the recording to the press so as to create a huge scandal, making Italy the equal of all other social democracies and forcing its citizens, since they are in the shit up to their necks, to go round with their heads held high. The lights go out. There is an explosion, and when the lights come on again, it's found that the maniac is no longer in the room. Downstairs in the crowd, a group of people is seen to be gathering around a body which has fallen inexplicably from a window, but the people in the room are indifferent. The journalist leaves to report her story, and the policemen take keys out of their pockets and unlock their handcuffs. There is a knock on the door, and a bearded newcomer, instantly recognizable as the actor who played the maniac, walks into the room. He is set upon by the policeman. They fall back in dismay when they find they have been victims of another double bluff, and the newcomer is a real judge sent by Rome to conduct an inquiry into the death, accidental or otherwise, of the anarchists in police custody. This is the end of the summary of Act 2, and with this we come to the end of this lecture, and in the next lecture we will be discussing the play Accidental Death of an Anarchist as Politics of Farce. Thank you very much for listening.